All right, good day students, and welcome to today's class or today's session. My name is Isaac Okoli from Umgungundlovu TVET College, and I welcome you. And today we'll be looking at Public Administration N4, and our topic will be the executive authority of the three levels of government. The executive authority of the three levels of government. And as we start, we will look at what to achieve, the outcomes of today's session. Now, the first outcome is that we should know the objectives and functions of executive functionaries and institutions on all three levels of government. We should also be able to describe the powers of the executive office bearers. So these are the two main objectives that we should or we hope to achieve at the end of the session. Now, before we start, it is important to know what learning should be in place before we start, and that's basically the hierarchy of authorities. In other words, before coming to today's session, you should have learned the hierarchy of state authorities, and by this we mean the levels of government, the national government, provincial government, and local government or municipal government, if you like. So these are the various levels of authorities of government that we should have learned before coming into today's session. All right, so before we start, it's important that we just quickly or briefly look at the executive authority. Now, in simple terms or in very simplistic terms, it is the arm of government that implements the laws of the state. Remember, in some of your previous classes, you must have learned about the demarcation between executive authority, legislative authority. So our main focus today is the executive authority of the state. And we have said that the executive authority of the state has as its main function the implementation, or if you like, the execution, the people who carry out the various laws or the policies of the state. All right. Now, we should also take note of the fact that executive functionaries and institutions are subdivided into political executive institutions. Usually when we say political, it means that these office bearers or functionaries have been elected to government through a process of an election. Now, we also have the administrative executive institutions of a state, and these are the people who are charged with the day-to-day running of the administration of the state. Maybe an example of a political executive institution will be maybe the cabinet, and maybe administrative will be the various departments, the various government departments. Okay, now these institutions are present at all levels of government. These executive institutions, and we mean the political institution and the administrative executive one, you find them at the national, provincial, and local levels of government. So that is a pattern that we should see running right across. All right, so we start at the very beginning, at top if you like, executive institutions at the central level. What is their function? Their functions, amongst others, include implementing national, take note of that, national legislation. Now, developing and implementing national policy. Some policies are not national. Some policies are provincial, and some even possibly local or municipal. But the focus or the preoccupation of executive institutions at the central level is to implement national legislation and also to develop and implement national policy. Now, another function is that they are also to coordinate the tasks of the state departments. They are also to prepare and submit bills to Parliament. All right. Now, one common theme that you will notice, you might have noticed if you've been looking at previous examination question papers, is the use of illustrations or diagrams to illustrate the various levels and structure of government powers. So that is what we will be doing here. Once in a while, you might be required to use a graphical form or an illustration to show certain authorities of the state at certain levels. So that's what we will be looking at. And at the central level, the highest executive institution will be the cabinet. Now, cabinet is made up of the president as well as the deputy president and his ministers or her ministers, as the case might be. So cabinet is the highest executive institution at the national or central level, and it is made up of the president, the deputy president, and the ministers. Now, you'd also notice that in the diagram before you, the deputy ministers have been or do not form part of the link. In other words, they are by the side. Now, this is because of statutory regulations of the country. So ordinarily, they should not be members of cabinet. However, depending on the need or depending on invitation from maybe the president or a minister, then you might find deputy ministers participating in cabinet proceedings. All right, so we look at some of these functionaries at the executive level or the executive authority at the national level, and the highest of them is the executive president. Now, in South Africa, he acts as the head of state and government. In other words, Cyril Ramaphosa, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, is the head of state and also the head of government in South Africa. Now, in a country like the United Kingdom, the head of state is different from the head of government. The Queen of England is the head of state, whereas the head of government is currently Mr. Boris Johnson. But in South Africa, the president of the country acts as the head of state and that of government as well. Now, he's also responsible for heading national executive and administration. He comes into power or to office through an election, and that election happens at the first session of parliament from the party with majority votes. In other words, after national elections and at the first sitting or session of parliament, the party with majority votes at the national elections will then or must then elect the president of the country. He's elected for 5 years or until the dissolution of parliament. What are the powers and functions of the president? These are just a few, a selection. Time might not permit us to go through every single one of them. Now, he forms cabinet and heads it. He also assents and signs bills, but also refers bills back for further consideration. He calls for referenda where the need arises. A referenda is like a yes or no question, where citizens are called upon to vote yes or no. If you happen to be knowledgeable about the politics in Europe, you would have heard about Brexit. Now, Brexit became a dominant policy as a result of a referendum where people were asked vote for yes for Britain to leave Europe or no to stay. So that is an example of a referendum. All right, now the president of the country also appoints commissions of inquiries. Remember Marikana, remember the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Inquiry, just to mention a few. He also pardons offenders. Currently, you would have heard about offenders who are being pardoned as a result of means to decongest the prisons as a result of the impact of the coronavirus. Now, what about the deputy president? He's also another office bearer at the executive level, executive arm of government at the national level. Now, the deputy president, his term begins when he or she is appointed by the president from amongst members of the National Assembly. So the deputy president is not actually elected but appointed by the president. Now, let's move on now to the institution, cabinet itself. Now, cabinet is the top policymaker or the highest policymaker of the country, and it's also the top financial decision maker. Cabinet is made up of, we've already looked at this, the president, the deputy president, and ministers. How does cabinet function? Now, the president presides over cabinet meetings. It also functions as a consensus-seeking body in reflection of the spirit of national unity. In other words, they try to reach common agreements before decisions can be taken. Cabinet ministers also manage their own portfolios in accordance with decisions made by the cabinet. Now we move on to the next executive functionary at the national level of government. That's the ministers. Ministers are appointed by the president as members of cabinet for specific portfolios. Take note of the word appointed, not elected. Now they are appointed to perform the functions stated in Acts of Parliament and to implement government's policies in their various departments. Now, what do they do? What are their duties? They function also as members of cabinet. They also function in parliament. Now and then they have duties to come to parliament to give feedback about the state of affairs of their various departments. Now, they also function as political office bearers. Remember that in South Africa, ministers even though they are appointed, but most often they are appointed from the rank of the leading or the dominant political party. So they are also political office bearers. Now, they also function as leaders in their ruling political party. Now, aside from ministers, another executive office bearer would be the deputy minister, who assists the minister and performs duties assigned by the minister. Okay, so that's that for the executive office bearers at the national level. We now move on to the executive authority at the provincial level. And we start by looking at a diagrammatic representation of this. Now, at the provincial level, we have the premier who heads the executive arm of government at the provinces. And the premier heads what we call the executive council. And the executive council is made up of members selected by the premier. So the executive council is the top executive institution at the provinces, headed by the premier, who appoints members of the executive council to the executive council. So the premier is elected from the provincial legislature, almost in a similar fashion as the president, but at the provincial level. What are their powers and functions? Now, the powers and functions of the premier: to appoint or dismiss executive council members. Now, just a quick comment on the Executive Council. Now, very often we hear in the news about an MEC for this and an MEC for that. Now, MEC means a member of the Executive Council, and these are members who sit in that council at the provincial level of government. But what we have to understand for the purpose of this lesson is that they belong strictly to the executive arm of government at the provincial level. So back to the functions of the Premier. He or she appoints of the SMEC's Executive Council members. The Premier should also convene Executive Council meetings. In other words, the Premier is the person who is tasked to call such meetings. He or she also assents. Assent means to agree to a bill. And when he or she agrees, they show their agreement or approval by signing these bills. Now, where they are not satisfied, they could also refer a bill back to the legislature, in this case, the provincial legislature, for further consideration. All right, they also refer a bill to the Constitutional Court for a decision on the bill's constitutionality. For example, if there is any contestation or disagreement about the constitutionality of a bill, then the Premier has the power to refer such bills to be interpreted by the highest court in the land. All right, now let's look at the Executive Council. The Executive Council is the highest institution that bears executive powers in the province. And of course, it is headed by the Premier, and it is composed of the Premier and 10 members of the Executive Council, MECs, like I mentioned a while ago. What are their powers and functions? They determine policies for the management of provincial departments. They also run provincial departments in line with Executive Council policies. So that brings us to an end of the executive authority of government at the provincial level. We now move on to the third level of government, and that is the local government. Remember, at the beginning, I did mention that executive authority of the state runs right across the various levels of government. So right now, we will look at executive authority at local government level. Now, again, there has to be a word of caution. Even though it is assumed to be the lowest level of government, but it's also the most important to the extent that policies are implemented at local levels. In other words, every resident resides within a municipality, in a province, and then national. So municipalities or local level and local government is very important and should not be taken for granted. So now, the highest executive institution at the local government level is referred to as the Executive Committee. Now, do not mistake that for the Executive Council at the provincial level of government. At the local level of government, it is referred to as the Executive Committee. And there are three various types of executive committees. We have a collective executive committee where the executive committee is headed by the mayor in conjunction with the executive committee. And then we also have the mayoral, where executive authority rests mostly on the mayor. even though there sometimes has to be assistance, from members of the executive committee. And then the plenary executive committee is a situation where executive authority is reserved or allocated to the municipal council. So these are the three various types of executive committees found in various municipalities in South Africa. All right, the mayor, okay, let's look at the composition of the executive committee. The mayor and a number of members are determined by the municipal council makes up the executive committee. In other words, it's made up of the mayor of a city as well as a number of members who are determined by the municipal council. Now, what are the functions of the executive committee? To carry out the decisions of the local government, to prepare budgets for approval, to appoint municipal officials, to supervise financial expenditure at the municipalities. That's the functions of the executive committee. Now let's look at some of the individual office bearers, not just office bearers, but office bearers who wield executive authority at the local level of government. First of all, it is the mayor who presides at meetings of the executive committee and also has to perform duties that include ceremonial functions and also exercises powers delegated to him or her by the municipal council or the executive committee. The mayor may also, where the need arises, delegate duties to the deputy mayor, but will not go into great detail. Deputy mayor would also perform functions similar to that of a mayor or as stipulated by the mayor. All right, we now move on to another office bearer or executive office bearer at the local level, municipal manager. Now, this official is the head of administration at the municipality and is subject to the policy directives of the municipal council and is also responsible and accountable for the formation and development of an economical, effective, efficient, and accountable administration equipped to carry out the task of implementing the municipality's development plan. Now, this is very important. Service delivery often happens at the municipalities or at the level of local government. So it's absolutely important that the municipal managers and the mayors are on board in terms of how they use their executive powers to implement laws and policies. All right, these municipal managers also operate in accordance with the municipality's performance management system. Now, we also look at other office bearers at local government level. We also have what we call the city secretary, and who is in charge of all the secretarial duties, of all the official duties, arranging meetings and things like that at the municipalities. We also have a treasurer for the municipality who is in charge of the coffers, the financial upkeep and records of spending and expenditure and revenue of the city. Now we also have managers. These managers are in charge of the various city or local institutions responsible for the implementation of various policies and laws. All right, so coming to an end now, a quick review of what we have done so far. We have looked at the executive authority of government at the three levels of government. What has to be said is that the functions of an executive office bearer remains the same, irrespective of where they function, and that is to implement laws. However, their duties or the hierarchy of their authority will vary depending on if they are functioning at the central level, the provincial level, or at the local level. So that is what we have looked at thus far. We have also looked at the institutions as well as the office bearers or the functionaries, as well as their various powers and functions. I trust that this has been a very beneficial session to everybody. Until we meet again, I ask you to take care of yourselves and goodbye.